I'm Jackie from Minerva, and I'm really excited to work on this sew along with all of you. Today, we'll be making the Durban Jumpsuit romper from Megan Nielsen Patterns. What I love about this specific pattern are all the options we can make. We can choose a tapered leg, a wide leg, or even a short, and we can make these in a short sleeve, long sleeves, or sleeveless. We also have two options for belts, one with a tie and one that uses an O or D ring, or we can choose not to make the belt at all. Today I'm choosing to make View B, the sleeveless long pant jumpsuit with the wide leg, which I actually have on now with Minerva's viscose linen floral print. I absolutely love this fabric. Megan Nielsen Patterns make choosing fabric and notion buying super easy. There's a shopping list on the back of the pattern that includes which fabrics will work best for this pattern. It is important to choose fabric based on these suggestions to ensure that the fabric drapes well. We also want to make sure that we read the back of these patterns to figure out how much fabric we need based on our measurements. Now, before we get started, we always recommend that you wash the fabric the way we would launder this piece of clothing in the future. It's useful to cut a small square to just test the shrinkage amount first. Once that's dried, we can iron it and then see how much shrinkage there was. Once all of our fabric is washed, dried, and then pressed, we are ready to get started. The materials we'll be needing for today is fabric. I'm using this new Minerva exclusive linen viscose with this beautiful floral pattern. We'll also need some matching thread, interfacing, some buttons, and you can see the ones I'm using here are a light blue acrylic. And for the optional belt, I'll be using D-rings. However, you can choose to make the belt that does not need the D-rings. And of course, the pattern as well. Once all of our pattern pieces are cut out, I like to go over them with an iron. This ensures that all the wrinkles are taken out, and that way the pattern pieces lay flat against our fabric. Once all of our pattern pieces are cut out, it's time to lay them against the fabric. Here I folded the fabric in half right sides together with the selvages lined up together. The selvages are right over here, and the cut edge on this side over here. The selvage edge is the area that's factory finished. Now, this is the grain line, and you can see two arrows on each side of this line. This line needs to be parallel with the selvage. So making sure that when laying the pattern piece down, it's lining up directly with this selvage. The booklet does show a perfect way to line up the pattern pieces on the fabric to make sure that there is enough space for each pattern piece. As you can see over here, we have them all lined up, depending on if you are using a 60-inch fabric or a 45-inch fabric. One thing to note with some of the pattern pieces is that they need to be cut on the fold. So you'll notice the fold line on the bottom and the grain line right on top. You want to place the pattern piece parallel to the selvage so that the grain line is parallel with the selvage. So we just place the pattern piece right on the folded line, cutting and pinning around the pattern piece, but do not cut that folded edge. The last thing to note when cutting out pattern pieces is double checking how many pieces need to be cut. So for example, this back neckline facing, because it's cut on the fold, we actually only need one. Sometimes folded pieces we will need to cut two. So just double check your instructions here and pay attention to see how many times something needs to be cut. So again, this piece number 16 only needs to be cut once, while this piece number 4, the bodice front, needs to be cut twice. Because we are cutting this on the fold, we will be getting two pieces. Now we have the choice to cut out and make a belt. So if we're making a belt, we're going to use this pattern piece 17 for either the D-ring belt or the tie belt. If choosing to make the D-ring belt, we want to cut two pieces of the entire length of this pattern piece and two pieces of a rectangle piece. These are the dotted lines to show where the rectangle piece is, and then you want to go to the end for the long chevron piece. If choosing the tie belt, you want to cut 4 pieces of fabric using the entire length of this pattern piece. Now that we have the fabric and interfacing cut out, it's time to mark up our fabric. So we'll see here that the front and back pieces for the legs both have squares and some circles. These are markings to be used for later use and to place pockets. Here on the bodice front, there is a dart. We'll want to mark that up. And lastly, whether we're using a full sleeve or what I'm using here is sleeveless facing, there are a few lines here we'll want to mark as well. There are a couple of ways to make markings. For simple lines like this, we can just take scissors and make simple snips. That way we can line up these snips later on with other markings that this fabric will attach to. For larger markings, for example, these front and back leg pieces that need to be marked for the pocket placement later on, I like to use chalk. So the way we do that is we place the pattern piece like so and make sure it is matched directly to the fabric. Then I fold down the pattern piece here on the markings that are to our size, and then we take the chalk and we mark that line. Then where the other lines are, so on the bottom part of the pocket, I'm folding it down, and then we can mark a chalk line again on our correct size. Then when those two lines are done, we do the same for the sides. Now it's time to mark the dart. So we're going to lay our front pieces with wrong side up, and we're going to place the pattern piece right over it. And we're going to be doing this for both the right and left sides of the bodice front. So once we line up the pattern piece, we want to see where the point is in the inside of this dart. So wherever that is, we're going to mark that line. Sometimes I do find it helpful to add a pin to keep the pattern piece in place. Once the pattern piece is in place, we fold the pattern up like so, and then just draw the line marking that measurement to form the dart. Then we will fold the same pattern piece now the other way to form the second line of the dart, making sure that the two lines meet at the corner. After chalking those two lines, let's go ahead and just mark them one more time to make sure those lines are dark and bold for easier matching later on. We are now ready to start sewing. We're going to start with a stay stitch on the necklines for both the left and right front bodice pieces and the neckline for the back bodice piece. Let's start off with stay stitching the back bodice piece neckline. Here we're going to use a straight stitch and just stitch around following the curve of the neckline. Stay stitching is important because it helps prevent the fabric from stretching while we sew a garment, especially on these curved lines. So for the neckline, the armholes, and even the crotch area in the pants, we want to make sure we keep that shape when sewing all the pieces together later on. When the stay stitch is completed, it should look something like this. After stay stitching the necklines for the front and back bodices, we are going to move forward with the optional stay stitching for the armholes. We want to be sure that we stay stitch the armholes for both the right and left front bodice pieces. Now it's time to stabilize the fabric. We take all the lightweight interfacing pieces that we cut out for each fabric piece and check to see which side is bumpier. That bumpier side is what's going to be ironed down on the wrong side of our fabric. So it's the bumpy side attaching to the wrong side of the fabric piece, and then we can go ahead and iron. We always want to be sure that we're following the manufacturer's instructions for our interfacing, since this can vary. We want to make sure that we have the right temperature settings on and that we're holding the iron down for the right amount of time, making sure that the interfacing sticks to the fabric but also doesn't burn. If not using fusible interfacing and using sew-in interfacing instead, then be sure to sew this interfacing in at this step. After applying the interfacing, sometimes there is excess. No worries at all, just trim it off. Once complete, it should look like this. Repeat these steps for the interfacing for all the interfaced pieces. Now we're going to stay stitch the crotch area on the front leg pieces. We're going to start with a 5/8 of an inch stitch and sew around this curved area, starting at the top, angling down around the curve, pivoting at the mark, and then sewing down the crotch. Now we're ready to start making the darts. So with the wrong side of the fabric facing up, we're going to line up the lines we marked up earlier and make sure they match up. So when they're pushed together, the lines are hitting each other. Now, to start pinning this together, I like to take a pin, put it through a line on one side, and when the pin goes through on the other side, it should push through, also hitting that line. We can continue doing this up the line, pushing the pin through the line on one side and making sure it's pushed through the line on the other side. We'll want to continue doing this all the way down. When it comes to the point of the dart, we want to make sure that when we stitch, we're hitting that exact point. So here we're going to put a pin through the point of that dart to mark where we're going to end our stitch. Now that the point is pinned, we can continue pinning the rest of the line down, making sure, again, that all the sides are even. So when we're done pinning and we lay the pattern piece down, the dart is laying flat. Once we have pinned the dart on one bodice piece, now it's time to do the same thing on the other bodice piece. Now we're going to start stitching the dart. We want to stitch right on the line that we marked earlier. We're going to start at the side of the front bodice piece and following the line, continue sewing, starting with a reverse stitch to knot it where we began, and then continuing to stitch on the line. When we get to the end where the dart is, we do not reverse the stitch, rather we sew right off of the fabric piece and leave a tail at the end so we can knot the strings. We knot the strings here instead of a reverse stitch because we want the end of that point to lay flat against the bust. This knot creates a smoother finish. Let's now sew the dart on the other front bodice piece. Again, starting with a reverse stitch and then following the line all the way down, sewing a straight stitch. And again, when we get to the point at the end of the dart, we don't do a reverse stitch, we leave a tail, pulling the fabric and leaving enough string to be able to knot it so it lies flat. Once our darts are done, it should look like this. Next, we want to iron down our darts. So we want to iron down to the bottom of the bodice. If we have a tailor's ham, we can iron right on there. If not, then just straight on the ironing board, ironing down, making sure to really get that point down. The two front bodice pieces will look like this. We are now ready to attach the front and back bodice pieces. So with right sides facing together, we're going to match up the shoulders and the side seams for both the left side and the right side, pinning together so the raw edges match up. After pinning, we can now sew the side seams and the shoulder seams with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, making sure not to sew the neckline or the armholes. Now we want to finish off these shoulder and side seams. The first method is using an overlock or serger, either serging the seam allowances together or separately so they lie flat. A second option is to use a zigzag stitch on each seam. A third option is to make a plain seam. This can be done by folding them in and then stitching to protect the raw edge, essentially hemming each side of the seam allowance. The last option is using pinking shears. Once these seams are finished, we want to iron them down. Be sure to iron both the side seams and the neck seams towards the back bodice. The sleeveless facing pieces are pattern pieces number 6 and 7. We are going to take one of each of these back and front pieces and lay them with right sides together. Now we can pin along each end and sew along that line with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once our side seams are stitched, we can now open up these seams and press as shown. We do have 2 notches on the back piece and 1 notch on the front, but for easier placement later on, we can mark in chalk an F for front and B for back. Next, we want to turn in the raw edges on the perimeter of these facings. To turn the outside edge in 5/8 of an inch to the wrong side and then press. Alternatively, we can use a zigzag stitch or overlocker and omit turning in the raw edge altogether, and it will look like this. Next, we can attach the sleeveless facings. When the facings have the front side facing towards us, the shape that looks like an L will be for the left armhole, and the shape that looks like a J will be for the right armhole. Now we will match up the facings with the bodice pieces, with wrong sides together. The front facing will match up to the front bodice and the back facing to the back bodice. When pinning, match up the seams first at the shoulder and the arm side, also known as the armhole or the armpit seam. Now we can continue pinning all the way around. Once all of our pins are in, now we can sew all the way around at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that the seam is complete, let's make some notches around the seam allowance. This helps to prevent bunching in the fabric and allows for the garment to lay flat. Let's repeat these steps for the other sleeve. To finish the sleeve facing for views B and D, we are going to understitch close to the seam line. Understitching is a finishing technique that when the line of stitches that are sewn are close to the edge of the facing, they prevent seeing the stitches of the seam from the outside, and it gives the garment a nice flat finish. To understitch, we're first going to press the seam and the facing away from the garment like so. Next, we can understitch with both the facing and the seam underneath facing outwards. Sew a straight stitch on the facing as close to this seam line as possible, making sure that both the facing and the seam line are caught in these stitches. Here we are understitching, so we can see that the seam line is pretty close to that needle. Next, we will fold in the facing under to the wrong side of the garment and then press like so. We are finally ready for the last step in finishing this sleeve. We will now stitch along the armhole at roughly a 1-inch seam allowance from the arm side. Then repeat for the second sleeve. We will start at the top of the pocket. With the wrong side facing up, fold down the top at 3/8 of an inch and then press. Now we will fold down the top of the pocket opening, folding down at 1 inch. And again, press. Let's repeat this process for the second pocket, folding down at the top by 3/8 of an inch and pressing, and then again at 1 inch and ironing that down as well. Now we will top stitch where we just ironed at roughly 1 inch. Once that is stitched, we can now fold the sides and the bottom edge of the pockets by 5/8 of an inch and then press. Repeat this for the second pocket and then any other patch pockets. We are now going to pin down the pockets of the front pant leg. If adding these pockets to the back pant leg, these steps will be the same. We line up the fabric on the markings of the pant leg and pin in place. It may be useful just to pin where we will sew. That way the pocket opening isn't sewn down accidentally. Here we are pinning just on the sides and the bottom of the pocket. Next, we can sew these down and add some extra stitches if needed to the corners for extra reinforcement. Once our pockets are sewn down, they will look like this. Let's move along and sew down the side seams. We will take one of the leg fronts and one of the leg backs and place them with the right sides together. The leg front will be either piece number 8 or 10, and the leg back will be piece number 9 or 11, depending on which leg pant we chose to make. With our fabric pieces right sides together, we can start pinning, starting from the top of the pant leg and following all the way down, pinning as we go to the bottom of the pant leg. Once we have both pant legs pinned, we then sew the side seams at 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge. Once the side seams are stitched, we can now finish these raw edges in any method we choose. We can finish with either a zigzag stitch, an overlocking stitch, or use a serger. Then we can press these seams open or press them towards the back pant leg. Next, we open the two legs and place them with right sides together like so. We will pin our back crotch seam here. Once our crotch seam is sewn, we will then finish these raw edges in the same manner we did earlier, either with a zigzag stitch, an overlock stitch, or using a serger. Then we will press these seams open or to either side. Now all of our pant pieces are attached with a front piece, back piece, and front piece. Next, we want to lay the bodice piece with the pant legs, making sure that the side seams and center edges are aligned. To find the midpoint of the bodice, we can fold the bodice in half and then use chalk to mark that middle or use a pin. With right sides together, place the bodice together with the pant leg, matching the center seam first, and pin in place. Continue pinning the lower edge of the bodice to the top of the pant leg, making sure that the side seams are aligned. Once all of our pins are in place, we can then sew 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge. We then finish this raw edge with any methods that we used earlier, and then we're going to press the seams up towards the bodice piece. Next, we want to place the two legs with right sides together one more time, lining up the front crotch. We want to pin the crotch in place. Note the pivot marking we made earlier. We are going to sew at 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge between this pivot marking and the inseam notch. Next, we will clip into the seam of that stay stitched corner close to the pivot marking, being careful not to cut through the stitches. we're now going to press these seams. Now let's work on the placket. Take piece number 16, the neck facing, and the placket, which will be either piece number 14 or 15. Line up the plackets onto the neck facing with right sides together and pin at the shoulder seams. Then sew these shoulder seams at 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge. Once the shoulder seams are sewn down, we can then press these seams open. Now let's stitch around the entire outer edge of the placket, making sure to stitch all the way around and at the outer angled edge of the placket as well, right over here. Once those stitches are complete, we clip into the corners on the seam allowance, making sure not to clip through our stitching. And then repeat this for the second side. To finish prepping the placket, we will now fold and press in the outer edges to the wrong side. Alternatively, we may finish the outer edge of this facing with either a zigzag stitch or an overlocker and omit the turning of the edges seen here. Next, we turn the garment right side out so that the right side is facing outwards. We will place the placket facing over the neckline with the right sides together. Make sure that the raw edges of the facing and garment are aligned. Double check that the waist notch on the placket is lined up with the waist seam. My waist notch on the placket was no longer marked, so I'm going to take the pattern piece and just chalk it over again. Now we can pin these pieces together. I'm going to start my pins over here, where we will start sewing at the corner at the bottom of the placket. Then pin all the way up and around the neckline, back down until the other end of the placket corner. Once we are done pinning, we can then sew the placket facing to the garment with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, making sure to pivot as we hit the corners. So here we can see that we're sewing around the placket, following around the corners and the curves. When we get to the end of the placket, we will pivot at that point and end our stitch at the lowest point of the placket right here. So next we want to do a little clipping to help reduce some bulk. Let's start with the corner of the front neckline and then the corner of the neckline placket. Then, with 1-inch intervals, clip along the curved neckline seam allowance. We can also trim back all the seam allowance to help continue to reduce bulk in the placket and the neckline. Now lay the garment so the facings and neckline are laying flat and facing outwards. Then we'll press in place. Continue to press up the neckline and around the neck edges. We are ready to understitch one last time. So making sure that these seam allowances are caught in the understitches, we are going to stitch around the placket and the neckline as much as we can to prevent the facing to show on the right side. Once we're done with understitching, turn the facing inside the garment and press well. We want to make sure that none of the facing is showing on the outside. Now we want to sew the facing to the bodice. To prepare these pieces to be sewn together and ensure they will remain in place, we have the option to baste. Basting stitches are long stitches that are removed after we're done sewing with regular stitches. If choosing to baste together, we can either use a sewing machine, making sure our stitches are long, or, like I'm showing here, we can hand baste. Either will work. If choosing to baste, make sure to baste all along the placket and around the neckline and back all the way down. We're ready to sew this down. Starting at the placket corner, top stitch close to the folded edge and pivot at the corner. Then sew up the center front opening about 1.5 inches from the edge. When we get to the neckline, sew 1 inch from the neckline edge. Continue sewing at 1 inch until this next pivot at the second concave corner, and then at the second center front, top stitch again at 1.5 inches from the edge all the way down, and finish by pivoting at the second placket corner. Next, we are going to attach the plackets together. First, grab our chalk and mark an upside down triangle here as a guide for when we sew these together. Then we can place the right placket over the left placket. If the garment is laid out in front of us, then this will be on our left side. Carefully align the waist seam and the bottom of the placket, making sure that the angled edges are overlapped and aligned. Then pin in place. Here I am pinning the right placket over the left placket all the way along the open edge just to make sure that these sides stay in place when sewing down the triangle. Now we're ready to sew this triangle down. I removed the accessory piece just so that way I have more room to to sew this down. This was a lot of fabric to stuff in here, but just keep manipulating the fabric until you feel that the garment is laying flat. Next, we'll sew over the marked lines in this upside down triangle. There is a lot of fabric, so take it slow. If needed, use the hand wheel of the sewing machine to manually stitch. We can go over this a second time to make sure that this is super secure, since this area will get a lot of stress when taking the garment on and off. Once the plackets are sewn in place, it will look like this. To finish off the pants, turn the jumpsuit inside out and line up the pants inseams first. Pin that in place. Then continue to pin on the right and left legs. Now we're going to sew down the pant legs at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, starting on one side and following it all the way around. Let's move on to buttons. We're going to use the button placement guide, pattern piece number 19, and place it on the bottom of the placket. Here I'm using weights just to keep the pattern from moving. We want to be sure we are aligning the placement guide with the finished edge of the neckline. The pattern piece has a guide to show exactly where this placement should be. Once the pattern piece is laying in the correct position, mark the location of the button and buttonholes. Remember that the buttonholes will be on the right side, the side where the placket is on top, and the buttons will be on the left side, where the placket is below. These markings are where the center of the button should be placed. I used a ruler to make sure that the button markings were all lined up perfectly. And then I used chalk one more time just to darken up those markings. Once the buttonholes and button markings are marked up, it should look like this. Now it's time to make the buttonholes. Attach the buttonhole foot and remember that the markings on the jumpsuit are in the middle of the button. On my machine, I had to start the buttonhole about 3/8 of an inch forward to make sure that the buttonhole lined up perfectly. It is definitely helpful to practice a few times on a scrap piece of fabric. It should look like this when it's done. To prepare for sewing the buttons, I first opened up the buttonholes with a seam ripper. Then, with an erasable marker or chalk, I marked through the hole onto the bottom placket. This is helpful to make sure that our button markings are in the correct place so the buttons are matched up with the holes. Now we can sew on the buttons. We can sew the buttons either using a needle and thread, or if our machines have a button foot, we can sew the buttons on right there with the foot. Once it's done, it should look like this. We can now hem our pants. First, we decide on what length we want the pants to be. Try on the jumpsuit or measure the inseam. Then we're going to mark the bottom of the pants for that length. If measuring this way and cutting, be sure to add 1 3/8 of an inch to that measurement for the hem. To prepare for hemming, turn in the bottom edge of the pants or shorts by 3/8 of an inch and press. Then turn in again at 1 inch and press to enclose the raw edges. Now we can top stitch just under 1 inch from the hemline edge along the folded edge. If we want to add a label, now's the time to do that if we haven't done so yet. With a seam ripper, I just ripped out some stitches and then added in the label right here, and then just stitch it in place. Since we're making the D-ring belt today, we will take one chevron piece and one rectangle piece from pattern piece number 17. With right sides together, line up the short edges on the straight side and pin in place. Then sew these together with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and press the seam open. Then repeat for the other two pieces. Take the two belt pieces we just sewed and place them one on the other with right sides together and pin. Sew around the raw edges with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, leaving the short edge open. Now we can clip the corners of the seam allowance to remove bulk and turn the belt right side out. We want to be sure that the point of the chevron is really pointing out. So using a pointing tool can be really helpful with that. A pointing tool can be anything from a pencil, an arrow ruler, or even a chopstick. Then we can press this all down. Next, we'll turn in the open edge at 3/8 of an inch and press. Then we'll take either the two D-rings or the two O-rings and thread the open edge through. We then fold over this open edge by 2 inches to secure the rings and enclose the raw edges. Then we'll top stitch here along the length of this folded edge. Thank you all for following along in this sew along video. We really hope that you enjoyed watching this content and that you love what you just made. We'd love to see some photos, tag us on social media, and we can't wait to hear from you. See you next time.